This is Chad Wolf, and today Hogan, Gidley, and I will sit down with Morgan Ortagus, a former Trump Department of State spokesperson and a national security leader, to discuss some significant security challenges we're facing here in the United States. Welcome to The Tank.
Coming to you from our nation's capital, this is The Tank, your voice in Washington, D.C. and around the country. Broadcasting from the America First Policy Institute offices in D.C., this is the premier think tank podcast where we discuss the challenges facing our nation, talk policy, and advance America First solutions. Welcome to The Tank.
All right, before we get started with Morgan, I'd like to welcome to the podcast. We have Catherine Cipher here, another guest co-host. Very excited to have her. Catherine is not only a great staff member here at the America First Policy Institute, she is our Deputy Chief of Staff, but she is also a Trump administration alumni serving inside the White House in a couple of different roles. And you will also see and hear her on Right Side Broadcasting doing some on-air commentary for that network. Catherine, it's good to have you here.
Yes, I'm so excited to finally join the tank.
You know, we've got a long line out the door of folks that want to join the Tank podcast, so we're very, very excited. Well, I think we'll jump right into it. Obviously, the news of the week that I think most folks have been following is really a historic impeachment of a cabinet secretary. It's only the second one in the history of our country, and of course, we're talking about the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, something I know a little bit about, and that's Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas, impeached by the House of Representatives this week on a very, very close vote. It was actually their second vote. They had to, it's sort of a redo vote, but they did impeach him. And, we're going to talk a little bit about why they did it. Did they take this action, which, as I said, is a little bit of a historic action. But I think first we're going to hear from Speaker Johnson on exactly, in his own words, why they took this action in the House.
Last night, the House voted to approve articles of impeachment against Secretary Mayorkas. Desperate times call for desperate measures. We had to do that. He has abdicated his responsibility, he's breached the public trust, and he's disregarded the laws Congress has passed. But much more has to be done, of course, to secure the border. And what the Senate produced this week is silent on that issue.
Yeah, so I think he said it best, and I'd love to get your take, Catherine, because obviously you're probably like most Americans and humans where you don't follow this maybe as closely as I do. But I think there's a phrase that the speaker used, which is unprecedented times call for unprecedented action, or somewhere thereof. And I think that's what we're facing here. This doesn't happen a lot. Everyone acknowledges that. But what we've experienced over the last 3 years is unlike anything we've experienced before. And you have the House of Representatives, at least the conservatives in the House, that says enough's enough. We're taking action to hold someone accountable. But would love to get your sort of outsider's view of this.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, obviously, this was an issue that was near and dear to the heart of the former administration. And Chad, you led a lot of the successes that we had. But first of all, I think it's a huge win, obviously. But what I take away from Speaker Johnson's remarks is that much more has to be done. You look at Biden, he ran in 2020 on the promise of no deportations. And by doing this, he invited the whole country to come in, we invited everybody to come into our country with absolutely no plan of what we were going to do with them. And the Biden administration at this point, they need an out. And so I think that that's why they've also kind of let this happen in a way, because they know that this is partly their responsibility. Remember, when Joe Biden entered office, he gave this issue to Kamala Harris because it was not a priority to him. He wanted it to go away. He gave it to the vice president.
The border czar.
Yes.
She's our border czar.
Yes.
Well, presumably.
Yeah, exactly my point. And, the actions by the department at this point have endangered the lives of all Americans and Border Patrol agents. But I think that, he's the first cabinet secretary in 150 years to be impeached.
That's right.
Why are we not reflecting on the role of the cabinet secretary? Chad, you were the former cabinet secretary. A lot of the actions that this agency is doing, they're being directed by the president. Much more, again, going back to Speaker Johnson's point, is there is much more to be done. And
Yeah, it's such a good point because a lot of folks bring that up, which is, okay, you can impeach the secretary, but the president is still the president, and the policies are being made from the White House. Yeah, I see the point there, but for me, this was about accountability, and the American people are just saying enough's enough. I'm tired of this. I mean, if you look at any polling, right, it's his worst issue by far, and there's a lot of bad issues because there's a lot of bad policy. But this one ranks at the lowest for these guys, and so I think it's interesting. But what's also interesting is, I don't know if you noticed, Catherine, some of their language and messaging has changed, and so we've got a couple of clips we'll share here because I think it's really, really interesting. Something's happening here that they have decided to change their language. I think we've got the first clip. It's actually the president, who doesn't talk a lot about the border. We got him. We have a clip of him.
Do you think it's unconstitutional? Are you on the same page with Prime Minister Netanyahu that the border is secure, sir?
No, it's not.
Okay, so that's the president, and it's hard to hear. I appreciate it, and there's a band in the background. But he was asked, "Is the border secure?" And his answer was, "No, it's not." That is the first time we've heard the president say that. It's been 3 years of a really bad situation along that border. First time we've heard him say that. Second clip will be of Secretary Mayorkas this past weekend, so several days ago, on, I believe it was Meet the Press.
For what is happening at the border, what the president himself has called a crisis.
It certainly is a crisis. And
okay, so now we have the secretary saying it's a crisis. We have the president saying the border's unsecure. My question, it's going to be an unfair question to you, Catherine, is what's changed? Because as late as 2 weeks ago, it was neither a crisis nor was the border unsecure. And now both of them have changed their rhetoric. And I think people are like, what? Wait a minute. You spent 3 years telling me it was secure. There was no crisis. And now all of a sudden, in the course of about 7 days, both of them have flipped their messaging. I
mean, you can't deny what's happening in the country. You've got rising crime rates. You have fentanyl flooding through the borders. You have human trafficking on the rise. You can't just turn away from this issue anymore. And that's why I'm saying I really believe that the Biden administration, this is a win for them in a way too, because now they can distance themselves from it, and we cannot allow that to happen. We need to hold them accountable. Chad, every action that you did when you were secretary, I mean, that was directly correlated and related to the White House and what you were representing. And so I want the American people to remember that, yes, this is a really great next step, but we need to make sure that we're still holding the man sitting in the Oval Office in charge or responsible for what's happening.
Yeah, I think what you're getting to is at the end of the day, the secretary's obviously been impeached, likely, given the numbers in the Senate, won't get convicted of impeachment, right? Yep. And so I think most Americans are like, this is all for show. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think accountability is important. But then their next question is the logical question, which is exactly what you brought up, which is what happens next and who do we hold accountable next? And at the end of the day, that is the president. Let me keep the conversation moving here a little bit. Still on DHS, because I think it's important. We have reports now, because the Senate deal fell through, that DHS is now saying that ICE will not be able to fulfill their mission because there's a $700 million deficit because they didn't get funding in this bill. And so therefore, they're going to have to start releasing people. Yep. I find this, I mean, it's not comical because it's serious stuff, but basically what the Biden administration is trying to convince the American people is we have a terrible policy that has cost ICE millions and millions of dollars to try to administer. And by administering, meaning I'm pulling ICE officers and I'm detailing them down to the southern border for weeks and months at a time, which is very expensive. I'm flying migrants all around the country. All of that is costing the taxpayer a lot of money. And now they're trying to convince the American people is, you've got to continue to fund me to do that. Otherwise, I'm going to let bad people out of detention and holding facilities. And so we've got bad policy. We spent a lot of money instituting the bad policy. And if you don't give us more, somehow we're going to release all these other people. And, this is on Congress. it's hard to take sometimes because it's not logical, and it's just I hope the American people aren't falling for this.
Is Mayorkas bartering on policy?
Well, so you could say that's a threat, right? That's a threat, which is if you don't give me more money, I'm going to let people out. I'm going to let migrants go.
Quid pro quo. I know it very well. Quid pro quo.
We've heard that.
I mean, he didn't have the money to pay for what his department has caused. I mean, I don't know, Chad,
some
what
could
do
say
you
that's
think?
just bad planning, right? It's not like the crisis snuck up on him.
Which is exactly why we're in the position we are today with him. It's why he was impeached. I mean, he is
It's
the
tough.
leader of arguably one of the most important agencies that we have.
Yeah.
And he didn't plan for this. He's the one letting it happen. I mean,
Well,
tell
again,
me
the
I'm
crisis
wrong.
didn't sneak up on him. This is year after year after year now. It's 3 years of this.
Exactly.
He knows where this is going. He knows the cost implications of this. And instead of changing policy to fit the budget of his department, or at least the agency, in this case, ICE, it's, put the blinders on and hope that Congress will bail me out. And when they said, well, look, we're not doing that because we don't like your policy and you're not changing your policy, so I'm not going to continue to fund your bad strategy. Now he's like, okay, now I've got a big problem. I've got a huge problem.
Well, and it seems like even, the sanctuary cities seem to be turning on him. You've got New York, Chicago. You turn on the news and you've got residents from those cities speaking out against what their government, their local government is allowing. And so, Mayorkas has a huge problem on his hands. The people that were out there supporting him in this policy are now starting to turn.
And so if you look at those sanctuary cities, right, and let's just take New York as an example. Obviously, there was a big case in the news about illegal migrants getting into New York City and then assaulting police officers, trying to abscond to California, I believe, some of them being picked up in Arizona. Well, one of those has now committed another crime, right? Shoplifting or stealing of some kind from, I believe, Macy's in Queens, New York. And so it's sort of like we're now living in this world, in this country, where almost you hear about these crimes taking place and it's just the facts, but probably 2 out of every 3, or at least half, are involving something that's going on as a result of the crisis in the southern border.
Right. And I think that the other massive point with this is it's kind of a culture piece. I mean, immigration is not what it used to be. It used to be you come here legally, and you're proud. You're proud for the process that you went through to become an American. And when you once you got through that process, you were proud. But now the way the left has kind of made it, it's, the messaging is don't blend in, love the country that you came from more than the country that you're in that's taking care of you. Stick to your tribe and own your native cultures, and don't switch over to the American way of life. I think that just the hatred that the left has displayed, the kneeling for the flag, the tearing down statues of people that have done really great things for this country, it sets a precedent and it sets a standard that they come here and they see, and it just allows the rise in crime rates.
No, I think that's a great point, which is a lot of folks on the left don't like the country, and they're very vocal about that. And I think what you're saying is, the folks that are coming here are picking up on that.
Right.
And they're saying, well, if you live here don't care for these institutions, don't care for your law enforcement, don't want to stand for your anthem, salute your flag, do all these things that otherwise, 10, 15 years ago is just commonplace.
Right.
Why should I, as a illegal migrant in this case, do any of that? And so I think that's such a great point and insight that I think there really is a cultural shift that's happening. We talked a little bit about the Senate border deal that failed. Now, part of that, switching topics here a little bit, is some funding for Ukraine and Israel, right? And so the Senate pulled those two pieces out, passed standalone bills, or a bill that included both Ukraine and Israel funding. And wanted to get your take here. This goes to a larger piece of what's in our national interest and what should our lawmakers on Capitol Hill be focused on? Is it our borders, or is it Ukraine's borders? Is it our national sovereignty? Is it someone else's national sovereignty? I think Mike Johnson, the Speaker Johnson, answered that pretty specifically when he said, doesn't matter what bill the Senate passes, it's not getting a vote on the House floor because there's no border security tied to it. And so he's put a line in the sand, which I'm glad he has done, that says, look, before we do anything else overseas, Israel funding, Ukraine funding, we've got to secure our own borders. And I appreciate him making that stand for obvious reasons. But it's strangely enough, it's not one that most folks on Capitol Hill will make.
Yeah. Well, luckily it seems like, and it sounds like it's dead on arrival in the House. But I also, I just go back to it. Unlike, this is all about funding all of these wars going on overseas at this point. And unlike the current administration, we were told with Trump going in, how many more world wars are going to be started, and
it was how unstable he was, right? Mm-hmm. Or presumably, I mean, that's what the left and the traditional media and others were like. He's unknown. He's unstable. We're going to have 3 world wars all at the same. Like it was like the worst of the worst of the worst.
Right.
I'll let you finish the thought.
Yeah,
though.
but I remember. I think it was a debate stage with Hillary and Trump where she said we're going to go into World War III. Well, now, I mean, how many wars are going to pop up over the course of 3 years, and just the unstabilized state of the world? And I think that what is missing is the America First policies leading the way, leading by example, bringing peace through strength, and actually ending wars. That's not a talking point. It's proven in what we did from 2017 to 2020.
Yeah. It's about deterrence.
Yes.
It's about making sure, and I've said this before, but a lot of people would say, well, we don't know what Trump's going to do, so that's bad. I would say that's actually good. It keeps our adversaries guessing, and they may not take action because they're not really sure what he will do. And we saw that time and time again of the president leading through that through peace through strength that you talked about, and you don't see that now. And I don't think you see our adversaries respecting our leadership here and elsewhere, and they're taking advantage.
And I honestly wish the Senate would care as much about the American people's safety as they do, the people of Ukraine, the people all over the world that are, outside of these borders.
Well, it's a shift. It's a shift in the way that policymakers look at national security because I think for the longest time people would say, well, national security is foreign policy. They kind of equate the two, and that starts overseas, and I think that's a big component of it. But I think what President Trump and others really helped drive home is that national security also starts on our borders, our physical borders. Mm-hmm. And when you have cartels and smugglers and traffickers and a whole bunch of other bad actors along that southern border coming into the United States, trafficking, smuggling illegal narcotics and the like, that's national security. And if we don't do something about it and just continue to ignore it, it can get better by itself. You got to have some solutions here. So I appreciate it. I could talk about this for a long time. I'm passionate about it.
But do you think that any of it, because I think kind of going out and reading more about this, I think that there's a lot of people wondering if it's not by coincidence that this is happening right before a big presidential election. I mean, do you think that there is any tie to this big push now, or do you think that it's just, par for the course?
Yeah, I think you would be extremely naive to say, oh, just in January of 2024, for some unknown reason, did they start really talking about border security and trying to come up with solutions? Of course, it's tied to a presidential election year. I mean, otherwise they would have been talking about this for the last 2 years, but they haven't been. Almost radio silence, at least from the White House. The only time they really talk about it is when the White House spokesperson gets questioned, right? They don't actively address it. They don't
doesn't answer.
It doesn't answer. So, yeah, I mean, the answer is obviously it's a yes. And I think most Americans, when you had the president go out on primetime television and say, well, the border's the way it is because of President Trump.
Yeah.
Most Americans are like, what? As far as we know, you have been the president for the last 3 years. How is this someone else's responsibility, right? This goes back to leadership, accountability for your actions. And it's always the blame game with these folks and shifting it around.
I'm kind of stepping back to one of our previous topics, but I am really interested having the opportunity to sit down here and talk to you about an issue area that you know so much about. But we have the current state of the country. We have all of these illegals here. Let's say an America First candidate is in the White House in January of 2020 or 2024. Sorry.
2025. Yeah.
Well,
5.
2025. Okay.
Right.
What do you do day one in a DHS to help? Like, how can you remove everybody? Like, what? Like, what do you?
It's a great question. There's a lot that you can do probably on day one. You would reverse a lot of the not so good policies. I have a different word for it, but that's my PG word. Not so good policies that have been causing this crisis. You do some immediate things and reverse some policies, allow ICE to start doing their job and removing individuals. You have to send the signal that there's someone else, there's a new person in charge, right? New, quote, sheriff in town, right? It's kind of a phrase, right? And then that starts to reverberate down through the department, and it's, the media and the press will start picking up on that. Then the cartels and others start picking up on it. And so it's not only, it's a mindset, it's messaging, and it's also policies that you put in place. If I was a betting man, any America First presidency will likely have executive orders coming on immigration and border security, because this is an issue that, again, the American people, the vast majority of them want it to end, want the crisis to end. So I think there's a lot that you can do.
Sorry, that was a big question.
Yeah,
but
I don't want to give away too much either. But I think there's a lot that you can do on day one. Look, we could continue to talk about this a long time. We've got a great guest with us, Morgan Ortagus, very steeped a little bit on this issue as well, on border security, given her role in the State Department and how we work with our international partners to control illegal migration as well, and her views on a variety of other things, including the war in Ukraine and elsewhere. So we're going to jump over there. Catherine, thanks for joining the tank.
Thanks for having me.
We're going to have you back.
This is so exciting.
We're going to have you back. All right. We'll go over to Morgan here. Well, I'd like to welcome to the program Morgan Ortagus, who is the founder of Polaris National Security, host of the Morgan Ortagus Show on SiriusXM. She's a friend. She is a former colleague. She worked in the Trump administration, served at the Department of State, active in the U.S. Navy Reserve, wife, mother. Morgan, I think I got them all, but I'm not sure. Welcome to the tank.
Just all around good person. How about that?
Absolutely.
I was going to say, yeah, I used to be a terrible cook, and ever since my toddler turned 3, I'm now finding ways to cook and hide mushrooms and spinach and things. So this is my new hidden talent.
Oh, fantastic. Well, we really appreciate you being on the program. You've got a wealth of information. You're in the national security space quite often, on television, on radio, really explaining a lot of these complex issues. And so we're grateful to have you on. And we're just going to jump into it. We know your time's limited here a little bit. I'd like to start, before we get into some other sort of big picture national security issues, on the border, right? Because I think one thing that the Trump administration did really well was to define the security of our country, our sovereignty, as a fundamental national security issue. And those of us who worked in the Trump administration, including all 3 of us in that national security space, took this issue pretty seriously. Now, you were at the State Department, and obviously the State Department was a huge player in helping us to devise a lot of our security policy and elements during the Trump administration, and obviously given that relationship with Mexico, Central America, and other countries that had a role in the solution. Would love to get your thoughts on kind of how you saw it working at the State Department when you worked with Secretary Pompeo there, But then also, as you see the current, I'm going to say crisis, disaster, use whichever adjective you want, and get your perspective on how it's all unfolding right now.
Well, listen, it's a disaster. I mean, we all know it. The thing is to it that I think people tend to think that foreign policy, national security, defense, that everything should be looked at in a silo, and sometimes, especially with the way the media reports it, what's happening in China or Iran or Russia or our southern border isn't interconnected. And in fact, it is interconnected. In 2021, I think it was the fall of 21, maybe early 22, I wrote an op-ed and I talked about how the Biden administration was ignoring Latin America and they were similarly ignoring the border. And again, I think it is all tied together. So when you look at, there's so many different things and nobody knows the border better than you, Chad. But when you look at it as a number one national security issue, it's insane to think, and no one else does this, right? It's insane to think that we have not only an unsecure, but an undefended border. And we know, what really caught my eye and so many people like me who pay attention to China is, do you know that Chinese nationals have become the fastest growing group to cross the southern border? That's kind of crazy. Don't know that they're coming here out of the goodness of their heart. And we could go through all the statistics, but one of the things that we're doing, in my opinion, Chad, you're an expert on this as well. One of the things that I think is so perilous about our border not being secured and being totally undefended is the billions of dollars that the cartels are making off of it. And what happens whenever the cartels make billions of dollars? In my mind, the Biden administration is essentially turning Mexico into a narco state, right? Like this feels like the stuff that you saw in the 80s and 90s in Colombia, except that it's directly on our border. And so we are not only undermining our own national security, we're undermining the national security of Mexico, our neighbor, by empowering these cartels to where they're making billions of dollars and in many ways can supersede the efficacy of the Mexican government. And that's just one area where I think it doesn't get enough attention. But I got to tell you, the first time that we went, I remember with Secretary Pompeo, we went to El Salvador after Bukele was elected. I tell the story to say that I think there are shining and positive examples, no matter what the Democrats say about Bukele. But there are examples of where you could be a force for good. And, when we were there, the reporters asked Bukele, well, don't you want XYZ from the United States? Again, this is the president of El Salvador. And he said, no, we're not here to ask the secretary. This was Mike Pompeo, of course, for a handout. We can pay for ourselves. We want to fix our own country. So, the vice president, Kamala Harris, who has told everyone that she's ready to be president, that she's ready to take over, she talks about getting to the root causes. And we all know, listen, you don't need a study on that. We all know what the root causes are of migration. People are trying to look for a better life. And one of the root causes of that is when you have a central government from these countries that is not as strong, that doesn't crack down on crime. So if you actually care about root causes, then you should stop allowing for these policies that give billions of dollars, that allow the cartels to make billions of dollars, because then you are undermining the root cause by turning Mexico into a narco state.
Yeah, it's such a great point. You mentioned Chinese nationals. I actually tweeted out a chart probably now a week ago, and it talked about the number of Chinese nationals that had come across that border, and it went back maybe 10 years, and it's a bleep, it's a blip year after year after year. And then, of course, in 21, it just starts to spike. 22, it's higher. 23, it's higher. And once 24 closes, it will even be higher as well. So, look, they know, the CCP knows, just like anyone else, that the border is open and it's coming through. I thought an interesting thing, just to build on that, obviously, I think one thing that got a lot of attention, when we served in the administration, is we stopped foreign aid to Mexico for a period of time. Because they weren't doing what we were asking them to do on curbing some of that illegal immigration. And I don't know if you agree with this or not. I'd love to get your thoughts. What I say is, what I found, at least at my time at DHS, is that the Mexican government writ large was very transactional. They weren't interested in, please, can you do it, or cables down to Mexico City. It was what was in it for them. And so you had to give a little bit to give a little bit. So would be curious about your perspective on that as well.
I mean, listen, this is the one thing that when you try to step back and you compare the Biden administration to the Trump administration, I actually heard Pompeo say this once, and I've stolen it from him because it was so great. He talked about how every administration has a guiding principle, something that guides them, and it is sort of the northern star for every policy that comes up, whether it's healthcare policy, national security policy, like whatever it may be. And for the Biden administration, that guiding principle is climate change, right? They're willing to make concessions, for example, with the Chinese Communist Party over human rights, as long as they get what they want on climate change. That is the trade-off they're willing to make, because the climate change is the existential threat to them. It is their guiding light. It's their North Star. For us, our guiding light, our guiding principle was America first, and what was best for the American people. And that is the lens by which we all, both you and Pompeo and Hogan and I, trying our best to, communicate this to the American people. We said, for example, when we withdrew from the WHO during the height of COVID, it shocked and it surprised everybody. And I was like, well, listen, guys, it shouldn't. This is an entity that is doing the bidding of the Chinese Communist Party. It's spreading misinformation. It's lying on behalf of the communists. And without real reform, this is not an entity that we're going to be a part of. Now, a lot of people thought that was too, hard, and they probably thought withdrawing aid to Mexico, was too hard, or taking away UNRWA funding was too hard. But I think that there are a number of policies that the Democrats did not like how it was communicated, and they said, so we're not going to do that because the orange man is bad. Now, 3 years later, you're seeing them have to reinstitute a lot of these policies that we pursued in the Trump administration because they were good policies. And the Democrats focus, and Biden in particular, focuses so much on what Trump says instead of what our policies actually enacted. And I think our policies are actually quite popular with American people. I mean, Iran is a great example. There's a Wall Street Journal editorial from Dave Shanker about this yesterday, how they're having to walk back everything they did for the past 3 years in Iran and pursue Trump administration policies.
That is such a great point and observation, Morgan, because so much was deemed unpopular and unproductive by the mainstream media turned out to be effective policy that actually did put America first and protected our citizens. And you hit on something here I think is important. You're talking about some of the issues as it related to Mexico with the bargaining chips, if you will, with we're gonna withhold certain funding for you guys. We're gonna tariff you into oblivion. Oh, and by the way, while we're on the subject of the border, what about NATO? Other countries that don't pay their fair share in these agreements where America becomes the world's piggy bank. I guess my question to you is, as you saw that working with Pompeo and so many others, how effective is that when you have a country that is feared, loved, and quite frankly respected more than it has been in a while, and the leader of that country says, look, I know you guys are for the citizens in your country first. I'm for the citizens in my country first. So I'm going to do what's best for us. Now you need to play ball with us in a way that really goes to enhance not just my policies, but the lives of the people here in America. How vital is that for an American president to be that way and negotiate on those terms?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head, Hogan. And it's not about not wanting to lead. Of course we want to lead. What I say to countries that have a problem with they feel like sometimes, I think when we say that, Hogan, some countries feel like it's very transactional. I feel like it's just very overt about where we are and who we are and what we care about. And that's what the American people from both parties have been trying to say to us. Like, listen, and I saw this in 2016. I don't know about you, Hogan, but I went to both conventions. I went to both the Republican and Democratic conventions with Fox when I was, working for them. And when I went into Democratic convention, I was shocked at how many anti-TPP signs were all over the place. Now, TPP is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the trade deal that was the crowning jewel of the Obama administration. Now, I'm a fair trade kind of person. I wish that we were negotiating more deals like Trump did with USMCA, like Trump did with Japan. I'm all for those kind of Trump negotiated trade deals, and Biden has, has not been able to get any of them. What I say to these countries who may think that America is just being too brash or too blunt, I'm like, listen, we're putting our cards on the table, that we have to make foreign policy decisions that are in the best interest of our people. That doesn't mean that we don't want to partner with you. That doesn't mean that we don't want to share with you or lead or be in alliances. That's the opposite of what it means, actually. We expect you to put your own people first, and everybody should be, focused on keeping their country safe and secure. And finally, I'd say, also, what is your alternative? If you don't want aid for the United States that maybe perhaps comes in the form of a loan instead of a handout, you can go get that aid from the Chinese Communist Party. And I hope that you don't get too attached to your fancy little port, because the commies are going to own it pretty soon. So, there are binary choices in this world. And if you don't want to partner with the U.S., we're going to be very candid. We're going to be very frank about who we are and what we're doing. And that's the opposite of what the Chinese have to offer, which is they sell you, they're like a payday loan shark, right? They sell you a bill of goods and you take the free money. And then, 5 years down the road, they own your port. So at least we're being transparent about where we are.
It's a great point. We talk a lot recently, particularly in the national security space, about making sure that we keep our eye on the prize, and the prize being probably our largest adversary, the Communist Party of China. But let me pivot real quick, which I think was part of that. On Ukraine and Israel aid, which is obviously continues to be a hot topic here in D.C. We had some bills that passed the Senate, the House. The Speaker Johnson has indicated they're kind of like not going to be considered because there's not border security funding or solutions embedded in there. Would love to get your take on those aid packages to those two specific countries in general, and just kind of your overall view of at least where the speaker's at and kind of how they're dealing with this.
Yeah, so I think what I hope can happen is that the speaker can make the supplemental better than it is now. And I do think it's possible to do it. I mean, listen, it takes 2/3 of the House to pass it according to the mechanism that it was sent by the Senate. That number, the reality is that number is unpalatable at the moment. I do think former President Trump had a few really great ideas that could be instituted. What I don't think should happen, in my opinion, I don't think it's great for Speaker Johnson just to say, well, this is dead on arrival. No, negotiate. That's the whole point, right? Like the immigration bill, one of the big problems with it, what Lankford negotiated, is he didn't have Speaker Johnson in on the process. They didn't allow for amendments after the bill was released to the public, and it was basically dead on arrival. So that was a stupid and ham-handed way to try and shove it down people's throats in a way that was never going to pass the House, so it didn't make sense. So former President Trump's plan to look at this type of U.S. assistance and make it a loan instead of just a grant, I think is really smart. And by the way, we have a history of this, right? We have Lend-Lease. We had, the Marshall Plan that everybody talked about after World War II. The Marshall Plan, it's interesting. I looked this up today because I wanted to remind myself of it. It is often cited as a grant program, but the assistance came with expectations for economic reform, cooperation with the United States. Some of the funds from the Marshall Plan, which is something that is famously talked and about foreign policy, were expected to be repaid. And so I don't think, by the way, you could look at post-World War I reparations, you could look at the Mutual Defense Assistance Program, South Korea post the Korean War. They received substantial economic aid and military assistance from the United States, but the economic aid to South Korea was in the form of grants, but they were also loans that South Korea paid over time. So there is plenty of modern history from the United States where we helped allies and friends, but we did it in a way that they had to pay it back. And I think that that's a very good suggestion by the president. I was on TV talking about it the other day. I have a home studio in my house in Nashville. And I said, listen, if I walk out and go talk to my neighbors out of my house here in Nashville and say, hey, how do you feel about the Ukrainians or the Taiwanese, this and that? How do you feel about us making our our grants to them loans instead. And even if it's a long-term loan, something that they have to pay back over time, not immediately, how do you feel about that? I think given our debt levels, most Americans will say, well, yeah, that makes sense. Happy to help them, but they should also work on paying us back. So I think that's one thing that could perhaps make the supplemental a little bit more palatable. I also hope that the House could negotiate some things in the supplemental for the border. That doesn't mean that you have to go back to some sort of massive comprehensive immigration reform bill that's sort of like touching the third rail. You know this better than me, Chad, but I do think that there are provisions that the House could put in to make the supplemental more palatable. So what I would say is, listen, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There are things in the supplemental that I would like to see saved, specifically as it comes to, our own munition supply chain. Listen, we are in a world of hurt, especially as we are constantly having to defend ourselves against the Houthis and the weaponry that we're using there. So there's some good things in the supplemental. As it stands, it's not going to pass the House. But, what I would say is, the House Speaker Johnson should, what was President Trump's famous book, The Art of the Deal? Like, the art of the deal, make a deal. Like, let's try and turn this around into something positive for the American people.
That is absolutely correct. And I will tell you, Morgan, I was asked the other day on television, hey, how come the right is so against all of these deals and all the with other nations? I said, no, it's not that the right isn't against the deals. They're for receipts. What is this money being spent on? These are our tax dollars, and the left is fixated, and they have never seen an American tax dollar they wouldn't spend for their own pet projects. And so when you take a look at some of the stuff you're outlining in the supplemental, yes, but also with the bigger negotiations with like NATO and other things, isn't it reasonable and rational to say, wait a minute, you're asking all of these nations to put forth money. It seems like America, as Donald Trump would say, is the world's piggy bank. How do we prevent that from happening? Number one. But then also, isn't it just something that makes common sense to the people, as you mentioned, in your neighborhood in Nashville, that if everyone's supposed to pay a certain percentage of their GDP into these organizations, and we're the only ones doing it, it sets a tone and a tenor for the rest of the world to go, hey, don't worry, the American taxpayer has it. And we send money, good after bad, into black holes all the time. It's not that we shouldn't spend the money, but you're going to have to sell the American people on why, and you're going to have to give us receipts. It just seems like they don't do that.
Well, I would say you're right about that, completely. But I would say that there was improvement in the Trump administration under that. So obviously, I think exactly the way that you characterized it, Hogan, is what President Trump said in our administration. And we did see change under, by the end of 2020. So everybody knows that most NATO allies, I think it was actually only 3 NATO allies were meeting their commitment to spend 2% of GDP on defense at the start of the Trump administration. Okay, that's at the start. 3 of the NATO countries. By the end of the Trump administration in 2020, NATO allies had agreed to boost spending by $130 billion. So that's a lot. Listen, even by 2019, you had 5 additional countries start to meet that threshold. And then it has obviously increased since Putin invaded. But it is kind of, listen, President Trump was like a prophet. He kept telling the Germans, he kept telling NATO, he kept saying to everybody, it makes no sense that you say out of one side of your mouth that Russia is an existential threat. And then on the other side of the mouth, you make yourself completely dependent on them for your energy needs. And he was right, and he was right within a matter of years. So I do think, I think NATO is a vitally important organization. My grandfather fought in World War II. I just watched, by the way, if you guys haven't, I just watched The Pacific on Netflix and watched what our Marines did in the Pacific in World War II. I highly recommend it. I mean, what our Marines went through was just unbelievable. So listen, if NATO was in the fight with us after 9/11, right? NATO was the fight with us in Afghanistan. If NATO was going to be there with us on the China fight, then great, I'm all for it. But I agree with President Trump, no more free riders. But I guess the only thing I would say is President Trump did rail on this the way you said, Hogan, but we did also get results, and we did get more people to start paying their fair share. And so I do think it's important to point out that, hey, we did have success on that front.
Yeah, and that's where I was going with it because, look, I was there at NATO in that meeting. Pompeo was there, too, in which he told Stoltenberg, look, we're not going to keep doing this, guys. We're going to do it a different way because you're fleecing the American taxpayer. And as you said, the other countries began to pony up because they knew Donald Trump was serious. But in addition to that, which, of course, no one really talked about in the media, was, as a side note, Stoltenberg pulled Trump over. I was standing right there, and he whispered to him, and he said, look, thank you so much for saying that. We have been trying to collect this money for so long, and one legitimate, cause and effect from the United States, and here they come forward with all this money. I thought it was just a really fascinating deal. And when the media and the left just lost their collective minds over it, and as you said, the proof was in the pudding, the results mattered, and other countries started paying it. It was like, yes, that's what we've been looking for right there. I really thought it was a fascinating exchange.
Yeah, I agree. And listen, this is why I hope I'm writing actually for AFPI for you guys. You'll have a book coming out this year. And just to preview it, I'm writing a chapter on our alliances like NATO and other alliances and what that means in the Trump administration. And listen, I'm going to have to transcribe some of this conversation, I think, for the book. But the important thing is, as you pointed out, Hogan, is not to say that we're against alliances or that we're against partnerships. But what we are against is unequitable alliances and partnerships. And, I'm grateful for the countries that stood steadfast with us, after 9/11 and that were with us in Afghanistan. But these same countries, listen, here's the bottom line. We need to be able to count on you in a China fight. So you're going to have to pick a side. And you can't do what you did with Russia, which is to talk about their existential threat in one breath and then commit your entire energy supply for your nation to them in the next. That stuff's just not going to fly.
Yeah, and he was mocked for that with Germany, by the way. Remember they laughed at him at that event? And then sure enough, he turned out to be absolutely correct. That he was prophetic. You're absolutely right.
Well, let me move on here for another topic. Sorry there's so much to cover here. It's a great conversation. Morgan, some breaking news here that's actually happening as we tape this. There's the House Intel Committee Chairman Mike Turner is now urging President Biden to declassify information related to, quote, a serious national security threat. And I don't want to sort of guess at what he is referring to. Obviously, he got classified briefing that I believe now he has asked most members of Congress to get as well. There's some speculation that it has to do with the Russian Federation and things of that nature. And I think what the House Intel Chairman's point is that the Biden administration has had access to this information upwards to maybe a couple of months, and that he wants them to be kind of transparent with the American people. So I'm not going to really ask you to comment on what's in that classified set of information because we just don't know yet. But what's your overall take on the way that this administration is communicating, or I should say maybe not communicating with the American people about national security threats, whether it's Ukraine, China, Russia, or the like? And if you were advising them, what would you be telling them to do?
Well, I've got an op-ed that I'm working on coming out about this as well. But I think what has happened, in my opinion, is that in theater after theater around the world, the Biden administration undermines themselves. And so here's a classic example of how they undermine their own stated policy objectives. So you look at Russia, right? They're just Russia. They can't. And by the way, screw Putin, and what he did to invade Ukraine is terrible, and I'm against it. And I'll never have a good word to say about Putin. The guy is a thug and a mass murderer. But I think President Trump and Mike Pompeo understood how to deal with him. I mean, clearly they understood it better because Putin decided not to invade under our watch, but did so under President Bush, President Obama, and President Biden. So what was that aberration? Was it just an aberration under Trump, or what was the difference? And I think it's because we took a much more holistic look at our foreign policy. So if you think, Russia is this existential threat to democracy, right? As the Biden, I think we can all agree, the Biden administration, Biden himself likes to say that, right? He was yelling at House Republicans saying, if you don't pass this bill, you're weakening democracy. Then I would challenge, if that is the case, why have you allowed for 3 years an Iran policy that completely undermines your Russia and China policy? So your Iran policy, where you have not enforced the sanctions, you haven't enforced the law, right? That's just the bottom line. You have not enforced the law. So now anywhere from $70 to $90 billion, Iran is richer from $70 to $90 billion somewhere. Those are the estimates over the last 3 years from unenforced sanctions. They put $6 billion in an escrow to the Iranians, the largest ransom payment in U.S. history to try to get Americans out. And of course, they just ran around the world chasing after the Iranians. Meanwhile, the Iranians are not only getting richer and supplying Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, Shia militias in Iraq with advanced and sophisticated weaponry. So the Iranians are doing that. And meanwhile, they're closer than ever to get a bomb, right? So just last week, there's a report that we're days, if not weeks away from them having a nuclear weapon. Now, that's on the enrichment side. They have enough on the enrichment side, not necessarily weaponization, but we're still, closer than we have ever been to Iran having that capability, to Iran having that capacity. So if Russia is the existential threat, I wrote about this in the Wall Street Journal in the fall of 21. No, it must have been the fall of 22, excuse me, after the Russians invaded. We saw the Iranians sending these kamikaze drones, sending sophisticated drones and suicide drones to Russia that Russia was using on the battlefield and using against civilians in Ukraine. And I called it out back then and said, wait a minute, listen, guys, this makes no sense. This is undermining your own Russia policy. Subsequently, since then, they have done nothing about it. They haven't done anything to stop the Iranians. And now you see the Iranians reportedly, as of last week, providing ammunition, maybe even providing ballistic missiles to Russia. So the Chinese are also benefiting. They have just ignored sanctions. They've gone back to purchasing Iranian oil. So your policies are not only enriching the Chinese and aiding and abetting and helping the Russians and totally undermining your own policy, you're actually also creating the nightmare scenario that we all warned about after 9/11. So Chad and Hogan and myself, we all remember, we're old enough, we all remember where we were on 9/11. We all remember the 9/11 Commission report. What was our big thing that we were all stressed about and worried about after 9/11? We were worried about sophisticated weaponry getting in the hands of a terrorist group. Well, guess what? This administration has allowed that to happen because you've got the Houthis that have ballistic missiles that are shooting them right at U.S. ships. You've got these sophisticated and new age suicide drones that are used by the Houthis. You have Iran has obviously, Hamas, Hezbollah, clearly has this sophisticated weaponry. You see within, on October 7th, 33 Americans dead, 6 Americans still held captive. I believe the number actually has gone up of Americans dead because we have had 2 more killed. So I say all that to say is this administration is not only aiding and abetting China and Russia from their own weak and failed policies on Iran, they have actually put into place the nightmare post 9/11 scenario that we were all worried about, which is terrorist groups have sophisticated weaponry to attack U.S. ships and attack U.S. soldiers. We saw 3 of them killed in the past 2 weeks. It will not be the last time that U.S. soldiers die at the hands of terrorist groups from weapons that were provided by Iran, and they're doing nothing about it.
Yeah, it is terrifying. And I hate to leave it on that note. I do want to thank you for coming on today. It's been so enlightening, fascinating. We'll be looking out for this op-ed and also the book.
You let me talk too much, Hogan.
but the thing is, and you just hit on something I thought was fascinating, and that is one of the reasons we were able to do things like the Abraham Accords was because we rallied the region around a common enemy in Iran and their state sponsor of terrorism. This administration has coddled and cozied up to Iran, not just in the last 3 years, but under the 8 years of Barack Obama as well. So, look, we could go on forever talking about this. We just really appreciate you coming on, your work in this space, your knowledge and information, always helpful.
Yeah, Morgan, I think what we try to do here on The Tank is take some, kind of difficult policy issues and have some real experts on talking about it. And so we could maybe go a little bit deeper than others, but you're a great example of this, a wealth of knowledge, And you have a very unique way of simplifying some pretty difficult issues in this space. So again, we want to thank you for coming on. We also want to make sure that everyone that subscribes today to the Tank, so you don't miss any of our upcoming episodes. But Morgan, thank you again for coming on.
Text the word TANK to 70107. That's TANK to 70107 to get exclusive content from the Tank podcast and to learn more about the America First Policy Institute.